Speaker Dennis Bonnen is one of the most powerful people in Texas government. Now he's facing a lawsuit from Democrats, and the House General Investigating Committee plans to hold a public hearing on Monday. It all started after Bonnen met with Michael Quinn Sullivan, the leader of the conservative activist group Empower Texans. Sullivan says he has an audio recording of Bonnen asking Empower Texans to campaign against 10 Republicans. That's a big deal because Bonnen promised not to campaign against incumbent House members. Bonnen apologized to House members this week, but that did not stop Democrats from filing a lawsuit to get access to the recording, and it's also not stopping questions from within Bonnen's own party. For perspective, we're joined by Manny Garcia, the executive director of the Texas Democratic Party, and Matt Bikoviak, the chair of the Travis County Republican Party. Welcome.
Thanks for having us.
You heard the tape yourself. Does it really match what Michael Quinn Sullivan says?
It does. You know, and it's weird because I really kind of expected over an hour-long tape there to be things that I wouldn't have expected or some surprises. Because I talked to a lot of people that already heard it, because I'd read everything written about, you know, the tape itself. I really wasn't surprised. It basically confirmed the core elements that Sullivan said were there. The offer of the media credentials to his organization from the speaker, the desire to not have Empower Texans get engaged against Republicans in primaries, but if they were going to get engaged, that they had a list of 10 members that would be 10 Republican members they could go after. And then the speaker expressing a desire to not have Empower Texans spend money in favor of his primary opponent in his own race. So those core elements are all there, and Sullivan was telling the truth.
Now, Texas Democrats have filed a lawsuit. Why?
You know, we believe that Texans deserve to know what happens in their government on their dime. This was inside the Texas Capitol. This was during the legislative fundraising moratorium, and there was a discussion about political money being used to accomplish the speaker's political goals. To Matt's point, there were some really troubling things that were said, and we believe that the people of Texas deserve to know exactly what was said, and if violations of the law occurred, then people need to be held accountable for them.
Do you believe that the tape should be released?
I do, and I went into it believing that there would be some sort of ugly, insulting talk on the tape, and that it might be in everyone's interest not to have the tape released. And while there were certainly some comments like that will be damaging to, I would say, sort of tangential figures, I think it's in the public's interest from a transparency perspective that it be released. Keep in mind, the person who is at greatest risk of the tape being released is the speaker himself. He'll be the one that's most embarrassed. He's the one that's called for it to be released. So I do hope it gets released. I don't know if there are legal considerations. I know that the House General Investigating Committee may gain access to it through a subpoena. They're starting perhaps on Monday at their hearing. So my guess is this thing will eventually come out publicly, just a question of when.
I think a lot of people just think that this is par for the course. A powerful politician, you know, trying to make a deal to get something done. Why has it become such a big deal?
No, I think people on both sides of the aisle believe that they're fed up with the backroom deals. They want accountability from their politicians. They want things to get done. Things should be getting done inside the Texas Capitol. Not schemes to abuse power, not schemes to gain and protect more power. And you know, really, what the best solution here is for everybody to hear this tape, for the chips to fall where they may, for law enforcement authorities to get involved should they need to get involved if there is criminal activity, and for civil issues to be carried out in the courts if they need to be carried out in the courts. And you know, ultimately, the people of Texas deserve to know that their elected officials, that the Speaker of the House is getting things done inside the Capitol.
You know, this is really kind of interesting, too, because it's a Republican speaking against other Republicans. Who are the people that were on that list?
Yeah, and it's not obviously just the speaker that's involved here. It's the caucus chair, Dustin Rose of Lubbock, and it's particularly troubling to have the caucus chair, who's elected by the caucus, who leads the entire group of Republicans in the Texas House, be scheming against a hand-picked list of 10 members. The list of names are out there. They are 10 of the 25 Republicans who voted against ending the taxpayer funding of lobbying, the bill that failed in the House, that passed in the Senate. So why those 10 were chosen remains a mystery. I think two of the members did run for speaker, but once Bonnen got in and had support, they got out. So I think it's probably personality driven more than anything else. I do think the one thing about the lawsuit that's interesting is I don't know that the Texas Democratic Party and one Texas House member who's a Democrat are going to have standing here. You know, this was a conversation that was primarily about primary elections on the Republican side. The Democratic Party and a Democratic state rep were not harmed by two people talking about a Republican primary. So I just have to wonder about that aspect of the civil lawsuit.
Your thoughts on that?
You know, we look forward to going into court and seeing exactly what happened, and reviewing the evidence and making the court make that decision.
Do you think that what the Speaker said in his apology is enough?
No. You know, ultimately, the Speaker of the House cannot be involved in this kind of conduct. You know, both attacking members of his own party, betraying a promise that was made for the institution of the House to protect itself, for incumbents to not challenge against each other. Trust is broken, and credibility has been broken. But beyond that, you know, there is rumor of these vile and derogatory comments, and you know, the people of Texas cannot support that, and members should not support those kinds of comments from their leader.
What do you think about the apology?
I think he went further than he'd gone before. He didn't really apologize for the list. He sort of apologized for taking the meeting and saying some, quote, terrible things. Look, I think it was a good start. I think he's going to have to go further.
Well, we will be watching closely. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.